When I felt what my sister's husband's tool was capable of, I could not resist and reached the peak of pleasure. Good day to everyone on the channel. Lost love. I know that many will judge and curse me after this story. But it does not matter. My sister deserved everything, and I will prove that she is also one of them. My name is Amanda Miller, and I've lived in the shadow of my younger sister Lauren for as long as I can remember. We grew up in a small town in Ohio, where everyone knew each other, and reputations were forged at church socials and high school football games. Our parents were pillars of the community, devout Christians who believed in traditional values and hard work. My mother was a Sunday school teacher, and my father was the town's most respected Dr. Grove. They were the perfect couple, and they expected perfection from their daughters. Lauren was the embodiment of their ideals. She was sweet, kind, and obedient, everything they could have asked for in a daughter. From a young age, Lauren followed in my mother's footsteps, becoming heavily involved in church activities and upholding the values we were raised with. At 23, she married Daniel Matthews, a successful dentist who was well known and respected in our community. Together, they were the golden couple, beautiful, successful, and devout. They had it all, and they made sure everyone knew it. Me, I was the black sheep. While Lauren was earning praise and accolades for her perfect behavior, I was busy rebelling. I wasn't interested in church or upholding family traditions. I wanted to live my life on my own terms, even if it meant clashing with my parents. As soon as I turned 18, I moved to New York City to escape the suffocating expectations of my hometown. I never looked back until now. It wasn't that I hated my sister. It was more complicated than that. Lauren and I had always been at odds, competing for our parents' attention and approval. But Lauren always won. She had a way of making me feel small and significant, like I was nothing more than a footnote in her perfect life. I resented her for it, but I never had the courage to confront her until the summer of 2024, when everything changed. That summer, I returned home for the first time in years. My parents had invited Lauren and Daniel to visit for a few weeks, and they insisted that I come too. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but something inside me told me I needed to go. Maybe it was the desire to prove that I wasn't the screw-up they all thought I was. Or maybe it was something darker. I need to finally confront the past and settle old scores. Walking back into my parents' house was like stepping into a time capsule. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender-scented candles filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of homemade bread baking in the oven. I ran my fingers along the worn wooden banister of the staircase, feeling the familiar grooves and scratches from years of use. It was strange, being back in this place that held so many memories, both good and bad. I spent most of that first day alone in my old bedroom, staring at the posters on the wall and the trophies I'd won in high school that were still displayed on a dusty shelf. It was as if my parents had preserved this room as a shrine to the daughter they'd lost to the big city, clinging to the hope that maybe, one day, I would come back to them for good. Lauren and Daniel arrived the next day, bringing with them an air of excitement that made my mother nearly burst with pride. Lauren looked every bit the part of the dutiful daughter. Dressed in a modest floral print dress, her blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, she moved gracefully, with the effortless poise of someone who knew she was the center of attention. Daniel was just as I remembered him, tall, with dark hair and a charming smile that could win over even the most stubborn hearts. He greeted my parents warmly, exchanging pleasantries and hugs, but his eyes kept flickering over to me, lingering just a little too long. As they settled in, the house buzzed with activity. My mother was in her element, bustling around the kitchen to prepare an elaborate welcome dinner. My father was eager to show off the new renovations he had made to the house, dragging Daniel along to inspect the new deck. In the freshly painted living room, Lauren, ever the doting wife, trailed behind, laughing at my father's jokes and complimenting his handiwork. I hung back, watching the whole scene play out like a movie I'd seen too many times before. It didn't take long for the old feelings of resentment to bubble back to the surface. I watched Lauren bask in the glow of my parents' affection, and I felt the familiar sting of jealousy. She was everything I wasn't. Perfect, loved, admired, and she knew it, but this time I wasn't going to let it slide. I was tired of being the one left out, the one overshadowed by her perfect sister. I wanted to show her that I could take what was hers just as easily as she had taken everything from me. The idea of seducing Daniel started as a fleeting thought, a dark whisper in the back of my mind, but the more I watched them together, the more that whisper grew into a roar. It wasn't just about Daniel, it was about finally taking control, about proving that Lauren's perfect world was just as fragile as mine had been. I wanted to hurt her to make her feel the way she had made me feel all those years ago, and I knew exactly how to do it. Over the next few days, I set my plan into motion. It started small, almost imperceptibly. Little things that would go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. I would dress a bit more provocatively, wearing form-fitting clothes that highlighted my curves, or low-cut tops that offered a glimpse of cleavage. When we sat down for meals, I made sure to position myself close to Daniel, engaging him in light conversation and playful banter. I laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, and I made sure to touch his arm or shoulder whenever I had the chance. It was subtle, but I could see the effect it was having. Daniel's eyes would linger on me just a fraction longer than was appropriate, and his laughter would come just a bit too easily when I was around. I could feel the power shifting, and it exhilarated me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. Lauren, blissfully unaware, continued to play the role of the perfect wife, completely oblivious to the tension simmering just beneath the surface. She was too busy planning day trips and dinner parties to notice the way her husband's gaze followed me around the room, but I noticed, and I was ready to take it to the next level. It was a warm Friday evening when my parents announced they were heading out for a night with friends. That left the three of us, me, Lauren, and Daniel, alone in the house. I knew this was my chance, the moment I had been waiting for. As soon as my parents left, I excused myself and went upstairs to change into something a bit more enticing. I chose a tight red dress that clung to my curves in all the right places, accentuating my figure and leaving little to the imagination. I took extra care with my hair and makeup, curling my long brown locks into soft waves, and applying a bold red lipstick that matched my dress perfectly. When I finally descended the stairs, I could feel the electricity in the air. Daniel glanced up as I entered the room, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my appearance. Lauren was too engrossed in her phone to notice, but I could see the way Daniel's gaze lingered on me. His expression caught somewhere between admiration and guilt. I gave him a coy smile, enjoying the way his cheeks flushed slightly under my scrutiny. "While Amanda, you look nice," he said awkwardly, his voice faltering slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "Thanks," I replied, letting my eyes linger on his for just a moment too long. I figured I'd dress up a little since it's just us tonight. "Thought we could have some fun." Lauren finally looked up, her eyes flicking between Daniel and me with a hint of suspicion. "What do you mean, fun?" "Oh, I said lightly, shrugging my shoulders. "Just relax, have a few drinks, maybe watch a movie. It's been a while since we all hung out like this." Lauren seemed to relax at that, nodding in agreement. "Sure, that sounds good." We ordered takeout and settled in the living room to watch a movie. I made sure to sit next to Daniel on the couch, my leg brushing against his every so often. Each time he would shift uncomfortably, as if unsure whether to move away or lean in closer. Lauren, oblivious as ever, sat on the opposite side of the couch, her eyes glued to the screen as she munched on popcorn. As the movie played, I continued my subtle seduction. I would lean in close to Daniel, pretending to ask him a question about the plot, letting my hair brush against his arm. I laughed at all the right moments, making sure my voice was just a bit louder and more animated than usual. Daniel, for his part, seemed caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to Lauren and the undeniable attraction simmering between us. Halfway through the movie, Lauren fell asleep. She had always been an early bird, and the combination of a long day and a full belly had done her in. As soon as she started snoring softly, I knew it was time to make my move. I leaned over and whispered in Daniel's ear, "She's out cold. Want to grab a drink with me in the kitchen?" He hesitated for a moment, glancing at Lauren to make sure she was really asleep. Then nodded. We slipped out of the living room and into the kitchen, where I poured us both a glass of wine. We stood there for a few minutes, making small talk, until I finally decided to take the plunge. "You know," I said, swirling my wine in my glass, "I've always admired you, Daniel. You're such a good husband, so devoted to Lauren. It must be hard sometimes, though, being perfect all the time." He looked at me, surprised by the comment. "What do you mean?" I stepped closer to him, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. "I mean, it must be exhausting. Living up to everyone's expectations, always being the perfect husband, the perfect son-in-law. Don't you ever just want to let go?" He didn't say anything, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. I reached out and placed a hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat quick and under my palm. "It's okay," I whispered. "You don't have to be perfect all the time." For a moment, I thought he was going to push me away, tell me to stop. But then slowly he reached out and touched my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. I leaned into his touch, closing the distance between us until our lips were just inches apart. Then, finally, he kissed me. The kiss was everything I had hoped it would be: hungry, desperate, and full of the passion I knew he had been suppressing. I could feel the tension in his body as he pulled me closer, his hands gripping my waist as if he couldn't get enough of me. I kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all my pent-up anger and jealousy into that moment. We stumbled back against the kitchen counter, his hands roaming over my body as mine tangled in his hair. It was a heady, intoxicating feeling, knowing that I had finally won, that I had taken something that Lauren cherished. But just as things were about to go further, we were interrupted by a loud crash from the living room. We broke apart, both of us, breathing heavily as we turned to see Lauren standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. For a moment no one moved. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Lauren's ragged breathing. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Daniel stepped away from me, his face ashen. "Lauren, I don't," she snapped, cutting him off. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me." She turned her gaze to me, and the hatred in her eyes was palpable. "And you? How could you? You're my sister." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? I had done what I set out to do. I had destroyed her perfect world. Lauren didn't wait for an explanation. She stormed out of the kitchen, and moments later, I heard the front door slam. Daniel stood there, frozen, looking like he had just lost everything. And in a way, he had. "I should go after her," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah," I said, not really caring what he did next. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about Lauren, about finally showing her that she wasn't untouchable, that her perfect little world could crumble just like anyone else's. I watched as Daniel grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, calling Lauren's name. But I didn't follow. I just stood there, listening to the sounds of his footsteps fading away into the night. Fading. When Daniel and Lauren didn't return that night, I knew things would never be the same. My parents woke up to find the house empty except for me. The tension was palpable. As I sat at the breakfast table, sipping my coffee and pretending that everything was normal. But it wasn't long before the questions started. "Where's Lauren?" my mom asked, her voice tight with concern. "And Daniel, they left," I said simply, not bothering to look up from my mug. "What do you mean they left?" My father demanded, his face turning red. What did you do? I shrugged, setting my cup down with a deliberate clink. She found out Daniel wasn't as perfect as she thought. That's all? My father's face contorted in anger, and for a moment, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he just shook his head, his voice full of disappointment. You've always been trouble, Amanda. Always. And now look at what you've done. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I had done what I set out to do, and now I had to live with the consequences. My parents tried calling Lauren, but she didn't answer. Daniel was nowhere to be found either. I could see the worry etched into my mother's face, but I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret. Just a hollow sense of satisfaction. That night, my parents and I sat down to dinner in a tense, awkward silence. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Lauren and Daniel didn't come back, and my parents didn't speak to me beyond the barest necessities. Days turned into a week, and the atmosphere in the house grew more stifling with each passing day. My parents' attempts to contact Lauren were met with silence. They argued frequently, each blaming the other for what had happened. Though neither of them dared to direct any of their anger at me, it was as if I had become a ghost in my own home, haunting the spaces I used to inhabit so comfortably. In those quiet moments, when I was alone in my room, I couldn't help but replay that night over and over in my mind. The look of betrayal on Lauren's face, the way Daniel had hesitated before chasing after her. It was all so vivid, so painfully clear. I told myself that I didn't care, that this was what I wanted. But deep down I knew that wasn't entirely true. I had wanted to hurt Lauren, yes. But I hadn't fully considered the fallout, the way it would rip our family apart at the seams. The next few days passed in a blur. My parents were frantic, calling everyone they knew, trying to track down Lauren and Daniel. I stayed out of the way, retreating to my old bedroom, and pretending not to hear the arguments that broke out downstairs. It was only when I saw my mother crying at the kitchen table, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, that I started to feel a twinge of something. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the realization that for all my talk of freedom and independence, I was still tied to these people, to this family. I finally got a call from Lauren late one night. I had just started to drift off when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. Amanda? Her voice came through strained and distant. Why? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Because I needed to. Because you've always had everything and I've had nothing. That's not true, she snapped. But there was no real anger in her voice, just a deep, aching sadness. You don't know what my life is like. You think it's perfect, but it's not. I've had to fight for everything. Amanda, you're not the only one who struggled. I didn't know how to respond to that. For so long, I had convinced myself that Lauren's life was a fairy tale, that she was the golden child who could do no wrong. But hearing her now, I realized how little I really knew about her. Daniel and I were staying at a hotel for now. She said after a long pause, I don't know what's gonna happen, but I do know this. I can't have you in my life right now. Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her. I understand. There was a heavy silence, and then she hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time, feeling more alone than I ever had. My parents found out the next day that Lauren had filed for divorce. They were devastated. Of course, my mother couldn't look at me without tears welling up in her eyes, and my father wouldn't speak to me at all. It was like I had become a stranger in my own family. The house that once felt stifling now felt empty, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. I thought about leaving again, going back to New York and starting fresh. But something kept me there, something I couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was the hope that one day my parents would forgive me. Or maybe it was the realization that despite everything, this was still my home. I wasn't ready to give that up. The fallout from that night continued to ripple through our lives. Lauren filed for divorce from Daniel within a week. She moved out of their apartment and took up a new job in another city. Far from the memories of what had happened, Daniel tried to reach out to her to apologize. But it was too late. She had made up her mind. As for me, I was left to deal with the wreckage of my actions. My parents' disappointment weighed heavily on me, even though they didn't say much. My father's silence was the loudest condemnation of all. He would come home from work, barely acknowledge me, and retreat to his study where he would spend hours in solitude. My mother was the only one who attempted to bridge the gap, but her efforts were half-hearted. Clouded by her own heartbreak, she would ask if I was okay, if I needed anything, but the distance in her eyes told me she was still grappling with everything that had happened. I wanted to believe that time would heal the rift, but the day stretched on with no sign of improvement. I tried to keep myself busy, picking up shifts at a local coffee shop downtown. It was a far cry from the bustling life I'd left behind in New York. But it was something to occupy my mind, something to keep the guilt at bay. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest one-bedroom with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it was mine. For the first time, I felt like I was carving out a space for myself away from the constant reminder of my failures. I spent my days serving lattes and listening to the chatter of the town's regulars, most of whom had no idea who I was or what I had done. It was a relief to be anonymous, to blend into the background without the weight of my family's expectations bearing down on me. At night, I would walk the quiet streets, lost in thought, trying to make sense of where I had gone wrong. I replayed that kiss with Daniel over and over in my mind, wondering if there had been a moment where I could have stopped, where I could have made a different choice. One evening as I was closing up the shop, I saw Daniel waiting outside. He looked worn and tired, a shadow of the confident man I'd seen at my parents' house just weeks before. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes dull, and there was a deep sadness etched into his features. I hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. Part of me wanted to turn and walk the other way, but another part of me felt compelled to confront the mess we had both made. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. "I'm sorry for everything." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "Me too," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I tried to fix it, with Lauren, but she won't even look at me. She's moving on and I don't know what to do." The vulnerability in his voice was striking. And for a brief moment I felt a pang of empathy. We were both victims of our own choices, caught in the fallout of a mistake that had spiraled far beyond our control. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it would get better, but the words felt hollow and insincere. I didn't know if it would get better. I didn't know if either of us could ever truly move past what had happened. "I hope you figure it out," I said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. "I really do." He nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face before he turned and walked away. Disappearing into the darkness, I watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. This was the last piece of the puzzle, the final goodbye to a chapter of my life that I was desperate to close. As the weeks turned into months, I began to piece my life back together, slowly but surely. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could untangle the knots of anger and resentment that had built up over the years. My therapist, a kind woman with a gentle voice and a patient demeanor, helped me confront the root of my issues, the constant comparison to Lauren, the feeling of never being enough, the desire to prove myself at any cost. It was painful work, but it was necessary. For the first time, I started to see Lauren not as the enemy, but as someone who was just as flawed and human as I was. My parents and I took tentative steps toward rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and awkwardness, but we were trying. My mother would invite me over for dinner once a week. And though the conversations were stilted and often filled with long pauses, it was a start. My father was slower to come around, but every now and then he would make a small gesture, A nod of acknowledgement, a brief smile that let me know he was willing to try too. Lauren and I hadn't spoken since that last phone call, and I doubted we ever would. She had moved on with her life, found a new job, and even started dating again according to my mother. I was glad for her in a way. She deserved to be happy just as much as I did. There was a time when I would have resented her for moving on so easily. But now all I felt was a quiet acceptance. We were both on our own paths, and that was okay. Daniel's letter arrived a few months later, tucked into a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, he wrote about his regrets, about how he wished things had been different, but that he understood why they weren't. He apologized again for his part in the mess we had made, and he wished me well in whatever I chose to do next. I read it once, then tucked it away in a drawer. Unsure of what to do with it, it felt like a final closure, a quiet end to a story that had caused so much pain. By the time a year had passed, I found myself thinking less and less about Lauren and Daniel. I threw myself into my work at the coffee shop, started taking night classes at the local community college, and made a few new friends who didn't know anything about my past. It was liberating in a way to be around people who saw me for who I was now, not who I had been. I moved into a new apartment, a little nicer, a little bigger, and slowly began to fill it with things that made me happy. Plants, books, a comfortable couch where I could curl up with a blanket and lose myself in a good story. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was enough. There were still days when I would feel the weight of what had happened, when the guilt would creep back in, and I would wonder if I had made the right choices. But those days were fewer and farther between. And I learned to give myself grace. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn from it. I could choose to be better, to be kinder to myself and to others. One afternoon, as I was walking through the park, I saw a couple sitting on a bench, laughing together as they shared a cup of ice cream. They reminded me of Lauren and Daniel back in the early days when everything had seemed so perfect. For a moment, I felt a pang of longing, a flicker of the old jealousy that had driven me to do what I did. But then, just as quickly it passed, I took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over me and kept walking. I was okay. I was moving on, and that for now was more than enough.